Development of the wax pattern for this cast gold restoration will be initiated by the placement of the lubricant onto the die. This is microfilm, and paint it generously over the surfaces of the stone die, and on the proximal surfaces of the adjacent teeth in order to prevent any adherence of the wax to the stone surfaces. There will also be a small amount placed on the opposing model surfaces so that the wax will not adhere to those surfaces. Now, it may be necessary to relubricate this die occasionally during the waxing process because the stone material tends to absorb this fluid to a considerable degree. The die is then removed from the articulated model and the waxing is begun. Now, the soft green wax will be placed as a lining and coating over the entire surface of the die to begin the waxing procedure. This is to assure the finest adaptation of the wax to the die surface internally. And this lower fusing wax will flow more readily over that area. Now, as that wax cools, it's important to use the moderate finger pressure to maintain the wax, to avoid the shrinkage that may take place as the wax is cooling. It's important that this wax be flowed to place, and that each time that increments of wax are being added, that it flows along with the wax that was already present. If there is a cooling taking place in previously placed wax and then additional wax is placed, and that junction is not melted together, then there will be ridges and crevices and wrinkles, so-called, in the wax surface in that internal aspect. Again, the wax is held to place to avoid shrinkage and pulling away from the die surface due to differences in temperature and the fact that the die surface may be somewhat moistened as a result of the lubricating process and lubricating medium. Now, this will be continued until the entire surface of the die has been lined with this soft green wax. Now, the entire surface of this die has been covered with the soft green wax. There should be an adequate thickness placed on the finish line areas also. And it's time to return it to the articulator, position it to place firmly. Now, with some regular blue wax, I'll begin developing the supporting cusp cones. Now, on the mandibular model, I've marked the location of the lower molar, opposing molar supporting cusps, and the lower molar central fossa where the mesiolingual cusp of the tooth being waxed should be situated. as well as the distal marginal ridge of that lower molar where the distal lingual cusp would contact, so that there are those references to which the cusp cones can be built. First, the mesiolingual cusp will have wax added until the cusp cone is formed in this fashion, and then the articulator is closed until that cusp cone contacts the central fossa of the lower molar. Upon opening, it's apparent that contact was made, and this is indicated by the dulling of that surface of the cusp cone, and that's been slightly compressed so that that did make contact with the central fossa of the lower tooth. The second supporting cusp will be developed using the same procedure as was used for the first. Now, the central fossa for the centric stop position of the lower tooth supporting cusp will be placed in the center of this maxillary molar. Be approximately centered this area by the placement of this portion of wax. Again, the articulator closed as that's beginning to cool. Now, that should be positioned slightly more to the mesial than it was. So an additional amount of wax is added. Again, this is closed. All right, the addition of the wax makes it possible to bring this together and again register the centric stop on the central fossa of the maxillary tooth. This supporting cusp of the mandibular molar is the cusp contact for the central fossa of the maxillary molar as this is brought together. All right, that area has been registered adequately. It's now time to proceed to the placement of the non-supporting cusp areas. The non-supporting cusps now have been waxed into contact with the opposing tooth in this area and in this area. And the next area for consideration is the marginal ridge area on the mesial and the marginal ridge area on the distal aspect of this tooth. These will be built up now in the same fashion as the supporting cusps and centric stops. This marginal ridge area, of course, will compose a centric stop area just as the central fossa did. So the same procedures will be carried out for development of the marginal ridge areas and the establishment of the centric stops, just as was done in the central fossa portion of the tooth. The marginal ridge areas now on the mesial and on the distal have been developed in wax and brought into contact with the opposing tooth so that registration has the centric stop established. The occlusal surface is dusted with zinc stearate powder for evaluation of the occlusal contacts. This centric stop is the most prominent at this time. The other stops are not registering as completely as this one. This one may be slightly heavy, and the others should be marking slightly, but at this stage we do see that there is contact here on the marginal ridge, contact at the non-supporting cusp, contact on these supporting cusps, and contact at distal marginal ridge, and beginning to show in the central fossa. The development now of these axial contours and the must be done, and the filling in of the areas between the cusps and marginal ridges. The triangular ridges are developed, and the various occlusal fossae. The grooves will be developed, and the axial contours will be developed. And that will continue until the axial contours are completed, and then it'll be time to begin the refinement procedure after that. Some of the anatomical grooves and some of the cuspal inclines can be refined with this carving instrument. So a portion of these will be refined on the occlusal aspect, and some of the anatomical contours of the axial surfaces will be refined prior to moving toward the marginal areas. Now at this stage, it's important to be assured that the pattern will in fact be removable from the die without undue strain. So that an effort will be made now, and very carefully, with the fingers grasping the base of the die and the fingers of the other hand grasping firmly in areas that are substantial in the wax pattern, and squeezing the fingers against the others, between the fingers of the two hands, to place pressure gently to lift that pattern from the die. If it were just grasped open-handedly, it would be possible for it to slide off the die very quickly, and the reflex reaction would be squeezing of the pattern and fracturing it irreparably. So the pattern is carefully grasped and lifted in the line of draw of the preparation, carefully removed, and now it's possible to inspect that upon close examination, noting the kind of detail that is desired of the adaptation of the wax to the internal areas of the prepared cavity on this die. Now the pattern is set aside momentarily, and the die is again lubricated. The absorption of this lubricant has been quite thorough, and so before completion of the waxing of the marginal areas of the pattern, the die is relubricated in order to assure that the final waxing procedures can be carried out without having the pattern adhere to the die. Again, areas of excess fluid are removed with an air syringe. And then just prior to returning to the wax pattern, a lead pencil is used to go around the die at the finish lines, and the side of this lead is just lightly placed against the die. Very lightly, not any pressure to damage the stone die, but just very lightly outlining the very extent of the finish line of the prepared cavity. Now, with that definition, it's possible to replace the wax pattern in its preliminary form on the stone die, sure that it is completely in place. And in most instances, the initial waxing has placed the wax slightly beyond that penciled finish line area. Now with the ward carver, it's time to do the carving of the finish line and bring the wax just to that finish line area. Not overextending it and not short of it. Now as the carving proceeds, the wax becomes rather thin in that area, and it's possible to see the pencil line showing through slightly. And that gives a very good indication of how close one is to the finish line and the extent to which carving is necessary. Now I'd like to note here that the positioning of the instrument in the carving process. This carver is not placed in a position to have the blade perpendicular to the carving surface in this fashion, but is in fact tipped toward the user of the instrument, so that moving the instrument in the direction toward himself, the action is one of gentle cutting, but primarily a burnishing action. This results in wax which is not only carved carefully, but is burnished against the surface of the die on those areas of bevel of the preparation. And this provides an extremely well-adapted wax to those areas, and does it in this burnishing action. If the blade happens to be set up in an area where the blade is perpendicular to the working surface, there tends to be a more dramatic cutting action, sometimes a chattering and chipping. That may damage the surface of the die, and that may tend to carve more of the wax away than is intended. Another aspect of the positioning of this wax carving instrument is to position it in this fashion toward the die surface, because there is a curvature of this instrument as it gets near the working tip. And if the instrument is positioned in this fashion and carved so that the tip comes in contact with the stone surface, there would in fact be a resulting concavity of the wax in that area. This would be undesirable because it would not only bring the wax very thin in that area, but it would distort the contour and would not be a natural contour in the restoration surface as it meets the tooth surface. So the carving instrument is tipped up in this fashion so that the tip may ride along in contact with the stone surface and have this, and then tipped toward the operator so that the wax is being burnished away and will still retain the desired contour as it comes toward the surface. After having gone around now with the carving procedure for adaptation at the marginal areas, it may be occasionally necessary to lift that pattern gently on the die to be able to see the finish line, and placing it back onto the die to be certain that the wax is adapted and is not overextended, nor is it short of the finish line of the preparation on the die. In case it's necessary to revise the contour or the extension of the wax, that should be done at this time. Using the opposite end of the ward carver, taking a small amount of the soft green wax That will be flowed onto the area desired and then can be recarved immediately. All right, now finally, the areas of contact with the adjacent tooth on the articulated model leave a rather roughened, irregular, and slightly concave area on this proximal surface. In order to be assured of having that area smooth and also having an area which is positive of the contact area, a slight amount of soft wax is added to make that surface smooth, and this is called plussing the contact. With a very slight amount of wax added on that proximal area. And again, on the opposite proximal surface, a slight amount of wax added, called plussing the contact. Again, this is done with the soft green wax because it'll flow at a little lower temperature than the blue wax and make that addition possible. And in the finishing of the metal, this area then will be adapted to bring it into exact contact for the model and the tooth. I think we can see the very slight addition to that contour on that proximal